all different kinds of work from all different fields, whether it's education or global health or water and sanitation. As Chris mentioned, I work specifically on democracy, rights, and governance. You think of NGOs doing good work, work helping people out in the field, giving vaccinations, feeding people, teaching people how to read. But you don't really think of them as antagonists. But some people do. And it's growing more and more now with the trend of digital media, and you have political leaning websites that can pop up, and everyone writing blogs and Twitter and Facebook and all this information. You have a platform for more scrutiny of NGOs, because NGOs represent a major facet of what we call civil society. So you have governance, you have the private sector, and you have civil society. And civil society is political in itself. They work with governments, and that oftentimes can be seen as an adversary. It's very common overseas that we've seen for a lot NGOs working, where in repressive regimes or hard to reach areas, where you have NGOs being targeted. Think of Hong Kong that's going on. You think of Egypt. You even think of Russia, where they make it hard for NGOs to operate. But we're also seeing that more and more domestically as well. And as we begin today, great panel. Wanted to share some of the stories, specifically with Jihad. Jihad Salah's with Islamic Relief USA. Katya Vogt is with IREX. Julia Brothers is with the National Democratic Institute. And really want to start with Jihad's story. So Islamic Relief USA is a well-respected humanitarian development organization, impact both within the United States and throughout the world. But unfortunately, it's become under a little bit of scrutiny of that disinformation, folks looking at it as an antagonist when really trying to do good around the world. Maybe just kind of start with your story there.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be here to speak about a situation. Brian gave an overview, really, the closing of humanitarian space for many of our organizations to act, whether it's internationally or even here domestically, or even factors here, our organizations related to our international partners that impact their work. So I wanted to talk about Islamic Relief. But along with that fact, or let's take it at face value, the closing of humanitarian space, the ability of humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, civil society organizations such as ours to act, whether it be state actors, other civil society organizations, and so forth, take into consideration a couple other facts just at face value about my organization, Islamic Relief USA. We are the nation's largest Muslim American organization. We do both domestic and international work around poverty, hunger, homelessness, disaster response. And we're the U.S. affiliate of Islamic Relief Worldwide, which is the world's largest Muslim humanitarian organization, a major implementer of the World Food Program, receives money from the foreign affairs or budget from countries like the UK, the EU, the United States, and so forth. So, and in that, just for scale, again, for you talking about, we are a faith-inspired organization, largely funded by Muslim American citizens here in the United States. We get very little U.S. government funding as Islamic Relief United States, or USA. I think last year we brought in about approximately $80 million, but if you also bring in-kind donations from pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, we're valued closely around $140 million organization. We are by far the biggest Muslim organization by staff and budget, by far than any other organization. But we're doing work, particularly here in the United States and internationally, again, food pantries, health clinics, disaster response. Take that as a fact, and I think the other fact I think that you can also relate to is largely when we think of Muslim Americans as they're framed, unfortunately, consistently in the media, the frames that come up with Muslims consistently connected in some form or fashion to national security, counterterrorism, terrorism, radicalization, and so forth. So Islamic Relief, in our work, in many ways, we're kind of like the counter-narrative that represents the values of the Muslim American community, the way they're out in communities, improving lives, saving lives, and quite often working in interfaith or with other communities to respond to people's needs. So just keep that in mind. So, and third, there is a network part of, you'll say, this closing the humanitarian space, there's a network that's been documented by organizations such as the Center for American Progress, the Council of American Islamic Relations, and so forth, of a network of organizations that proclaim to be think tanks and research institutes that exclusively focus on the Muslim American community, prove that the Muslim American community is representative organizations are consistently terror sympathizers. We're part of the Muslim Brotherhood. We're anti-Semitic. We're for the destruction of Israel. And I say these are consistently, all the reports, all their attacks on various Muslim organizations, this is their playbook. Those 3 or 4 things are constantly brought up. They just rebranded. So what happened was in 2017, a little over 2 years, oh man, almost exactly 2 years now, during the annual appropriations process, when Congress is approving the different budgets, we were heading towards, in September time, the appropriations budget for foreign affairs, state and foreign operations, that also provides funding for humanitarian organizations. The money goes to humanitarian organizations to do development, response work internationally. Someone that you may know of now who is a governor of a great state, Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis, that I think many of you know, he ran very much on the coattails of President Trump. At that time, he was in Congress. And to be truthful, Mr. DeSantis at that point in time was a member of Congress of really no consequence very much. Wasn't on any very popular or wasn't well known, wasn't on the mic quite often until he started running for governor and kind of riding the coattails of how much he supported President Trump. But he built a name quickly, or came out to the forefront, by submitting an amendment to the Foreign Affairs Appropriations Bill that called for no funding shall go to Islamic Relief Worldwide, our international affiliate. Again, Islamic Relief USA and Islamic Relief Worldwide, we share common branding, values. They are our preferred international partner when we send money abroad, but we are technically separate entities with our own board, bylaws, governance, and so forth. But inherently, because of that shared branding on a global scale, an attack upon Islamic Relief Worldwide is inherently an attack upon us and who we are. Because most people at the community, at the ground level, will not make a distinction between IRW and IRUSA, use these short terms. So this was the first time that I known, and particularly our good friends at Interaction, that had ever seen in at least recent history, where actually someone identified a particular organization and attacked them or went against them through a piece of legislation, right? There may be bills saying we shouldn't give money to organizations if they do certain X, Y, and Z, but never explicitly stated an organization. And so this would have to take place, for it to take effect, would have to be voted upon in the appropriations process the day of where they're ultimately going to, or the day after, before they're going to vote for the final bill. We only learned about this, barely a week before. If you know how Congress works, people put in amendments barely a week before. They go through the Rules Committee, they get approved, if they're going to be able to get a voice vote or some type of vote, right, day of or the day before the actual final vote. So we had very little time to respond to this. And again, I want to thank our good friends at Interaction, because they were scanning the various amendments for the appropriations bill. And not only that, we had some friends on Capitol Hill who know our work, members of Congress and their staff who saw it. I was away actually in Chicago at a conference, and I get a call like on Thursday from Bill at Catholic Relief Services saying, Jihad, have you seen this amendment? Calling out International Islamic Relief Worldwide. From, again, Congressman, to me, it was like, Congressman who? Congressman DeSantis. So the process is quickly doing some research over that weekend, because I think that it was going to come up on Wednesday. Quickly doing the research, who this congressman was, what was his talking points. He was sending out, like many members of Congress, when they want you to vote for a bill or amendment, they're sending out messages to all other 534 members of Congress saying, dear colleague, please vote for this amendment on the day of, that it goes after this organization, Islamic Relief Worldwide, that supports, again, is a Muslim Brotherhood operative that supports terrorism and seeks the destruction of Israel. Again, it's consistent, all the attacks. We look at this and we do a quick scan and kind of place it into a system, and it spits out, it's almost word for word verbatim from Middle Eastern Forum. Middle Eastern Forum is one of the three major, again, Islamophobe organizations that's funded by the Clarion Project, not to get into the weeds, but is part of a network that's their existence, is to constantly throw shade in street terms, throw shade on the Muslim American community to create a chilling effect and to marginalize the Muslim community. And again, but this was the first time they had ever came after Islamic Relief. They attacked a lot of our civil liberties organizations, the Muslim community, civil rights organizations, but it was the first time they ever came at us. And very much, I suspect, is because in the past 5 years, Islamic Relief, we had finally emerged as not just a humanitarian organization, but a leading advocacy organization, as members of Interaction, creating a government affairs department, promoting our work on the good work that we're out there doing in interfaith communities, and advocating on bills and policies and protecting the vulnerable. I think this network saw for the first time that Islamic Relief was really a game-changing type of institution in the Muslim community that changed the narrative of how people could perceive what the Muslim American community is, the work that they do, and who they work with. Counter to, again, some of the negative frames that we get if you don't know Muslim. They always say that if you know a Muslim or been to a mosque or a family friend, it's a good way, it's a counter to what you see on negative news. As a counter, like there's bad people that do bad things, but I know that it's not writ large an entire religious community. So we had to respond in one, how do we first stop this amendment? Then how do we change the narrative? Because again, it's, in the long run, these attacks, whether it's from groups like MEF, the Middle Eastern Forum, they're not really worried about the truth because we're able to respond, effective media, talking points, showing our long history for the past 10 years for Islamic Relief of continuous audits that are required by institutions like USAID, the U.S. Agency in the Development, or CETA and DFID, some of the international equivalents. Islamic Relief consistently comes up clear when you do deep forensic dives in our audits. We're a very clear organization. We pride ourselves on the transparency in the work that we do. And then also, increasingly, many of our partner organizations, whether it's groups like Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, Salvation Army, groups you may already know and that members of Congress know, that they see organizations such as these, members of Interaction, actually vouch for our work because we're actually working hand in hand with them in certain countries. So we had to respond to Mr. DeSantis in one. We had our good friend, Congressman Keith Ellison, who took up our mantle, pushed back, sent out his own dear colleague based on talking points on the counter the offensive of Mr. DeSantis. Two, again, our good friends at Interaction working with us. And Interaction was doing it because, one, we're a member, but I think because we very much have vested ourselves in the past 5 years being a fair partner in the Interaction community, working alongside, building that relationship, just not from a programmatic side on some of these organizations, but also being on Capitol Hill from a government affairs side. But they also saw it very much as attack upon Islamic Relief is an attack upon the entire humanitarian, human rights community. Again, when they had never seen before explicitly an organization being attacked like we were, it basically thinks, if it starts with Islamic Relief, it'll be other organizations next, World Vision, Oxfam, and so forth, because we're also seeing that happen in certain places. So responding, we're members of these various organizations, making direct phone calls. And I'll say, good friends at Catholic Relief Services, calling Catholic members of Congress saying, no, we work with Islamic Relief worldwide. They are our partners in Central African Republic, in South Sudan. The Episcopal Church Relief and Development we work with, making these type of calls to members of Congress saying, this is not true, this is not the case of this organization, this is a smear campaign. And then ultimately, us taking a stand that if Mr. DeSantis actually takes up this bill, we're going to push back. And I'm actually sad to say that we actually had today, but we just found out that Congresswoman Anita Lowe is retiring, who was at that time the ranking member on the Appropriations Committee, was actually going to stand on the floor and push back against Mr. DeSantis if he chose to defend. You have to defend your amendment before it's voted on. And she's retiring today, such a good friend. So what ends up happening after this pushback, a response by a member of Congress, good friends pushing back, and that's also waging a campaign in the sense that we actually sent out two things. We sent out a mailer by email to all our donors and supporters in Mr. DeSantis' Jacksonville district, saying, call your congressman and bear witness to that you support Islamic Relief, the values that we represent on behalf of your community, and ask him as his member of Congress, as your member of Congress, to withdraw his bill. And then two, at this time, many people may not remember, Hurricane Matthew was quickly approaching Florida. The crazy thing about it, and this all before this happened, we're a disaster response team. We were actually already deploying into Florida, actually into Jacksonville, into his district, preparing to help communities weather the storm or the hurricane. So we're actually doing work in his district that he doesn't know about. preparing for a hurricane, and he's attacking our organization as being, a terrorist and, Muslim organization. So long story short, in essence, he did not show to defend his bill. His claim was, well, I had to leave early to get back to Jacksonville to be with my community and prepare for the hurricane and so forth. Okay, I'll take that on face value. But I think what it was also very much is we had a very strong, within a matter of 5 days, a rapid response, a critical mass of over 40 organizations, leading organizations, whether it be Oxfam, Lutheran Relief Services, Catholic Relief Services, and so forth, and Interaction, all sending in testimonial letters, signing on their name with the Congressman Ellison's letter, going to all other members, and then also getting a leadership to stand with the saying that she's going to push back. Miss Lowy will actually stand against and lead the charge against this bill. I think he made a calculated decision that it wasn't worth his time to continue pushing for this bill. And it's also, I think what it was is he didn't assume that the Muslim American community had the capacity, because the assumption that the Muslim American community is new, it's marginalized, it's not around, it wouldn't be able to have this capacity and capital to respond. So we basically, surprised him. Ultimately, I said before, it's not about truth. We're able to provide the truth about who we are, what the work that we do, and how we do it in transparency. But what we see is with the Islamophobic network, these organizations who engage members of Congress, it's not about ultimately proving or having their accusations proven. What they want to do is create a chilling effect. Again, we go to this larger environment of people not knowing who Muslims are, not familiar with them, and the natural kind of subconscious level of what we've been trained over the past 20 years or so through media about Muslims, radical, terrorists, so forth. It leads people to be, if you throw this stuff on the wall, you know what I'm saying, throw it on the wall, see what sticks. It creates enough doubt in enough members, potentially members of Congress, who are members of Congress are consistently risk adverse. You want no drama. So it creates a situation where, a chilling effect where, okay, I don't believe maybe it's true, but I just don't want to be involved with it. I don't want the blowback on me if I'm involved with a Muslim organization that does somehow eventually have nefarious ties. So it causes a chilling effect, which then again continuously pushes, kind of marginalizes the Muslim American community. So this is what we face of misinformation, and there's issues, particularly being a former staffer on the Hill, questions that we have to think about of what is the obligation, the ethical standard of where staff of members of Congress or the members themselves of when they're approached with misinformation or that's being presented to them as fact, what is their own due diligence that they themselves have to go about and say, okay, you're putting forth information against an organization that would, put shade on their name. There may be legal consequences to it, an impact. What is their obligation of actually just reaching out to an organization? Mr. DeSantis never reached out to us to even say, these are these accusations. What do you say in response to them? We were never given even a private or a personal opportunity to say, we are here to able to be transparent to you. So these kind of ethical issues of what is the responsibility of doing when your government, congressional members, their staff, to first fact check what's being presented to them by civil society organizations that have a political agenda. And then last, in that, it's unfortunate that even to a member level, member of Congress, where, again, it's maybe not even an issue of fact, it's about how a community, whether it be the Muslim community today or another community in the past, or how it's been Jewish communities or Mormon communities or other communities in the past consistently, is how are communities being used as political footballs for political opportunity. How they can use, basically, what we see consistently, organizations like Middle Eastern Forum, they engage with members of Congress that are coming larger from red states, states where there's a lack of Muslim American communities, a lack of diversity, or at least they're not there and politically active, and they see no political consequence if they throw such attacks on the Muslim community. There's no blowback upon them, or the scary part, unfortunately, it actually makes their political base, it's red meat for them. That's kind of the scarier situation that we're facing. But how these challenges that we face and the need for Islamic Relief and organizations such as ours to build the political capacity, the social media response, the information, the political ties to be able to weather these storms and response, and how do we control our own narrative consistently on Capitol Hill, at least on Capitol Hill, through our government affairs work and social media.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jihad. When it comes to my mind, when you said earlier about how do you question the information that you give to a member of Congress as a staffer, It's very easy. Now, one of the reasons I picked the Elvis song and Suspicious Minds is the idea of you're more suspicious of the actual organization instead of the information that's provided.
Correct.
And then you create this credibility issue. And for interaction, having one member, regardless of its a faith-based or a secular group or whatever sector that's working on, when you discredit one member, you're also effectively discrediting an entire organization, as well as the entire community that organization's in. And so that's a troubling aspect of it, of when you have Islamic Relief USA and Islamic Relief Worldwide working in not only Jacksonville, Florida, but all over across the globe, hand in hand with Catholic Relief or other big NGOs. It's that credibility of the institutions. And kind of moving on to Julia and talking about that kind of credibility of institutions. Disinformation is used to attack civil society and destabilize civil society, but it's also used as a political tool to fight against, political opponents, to fight against governance and government institutions, plays havoc in electoral systems. We all know about Russian meddling. It's a very hot topic, but this is something that's replicated across the globe. And Julia, if you want to, feel free to kind of highlight some of the NDI's work there.
Sure. I'm Julia Brothers. I'm the program director for elections at the National Democratic Institute. We work on electoral integrity programs, mostly election monitoring and electoral reform in countries all around the world. We don't work domestically in the United States. And our approach to this, the challenge of disinformation, has largely been kind of trying to build transparency and accountability around this issue. Elections are more than just one day. We oftentimes talk about there's kind of an overemphasis on what happens on election day because there are so many parts of the process that are happening before or after that have an impact on its credibility. As election observers, we've always tried to kind of update and refine our methodologies to meet new and emerging challenges and new and emerging threats to electoral integrity. So, when it was clear that authoritarians are, manipulating voter rolls in order to gain a kind of an electoral advantage, then we started auditing voters lists, and you make sure that you monitor the voter registration process. When it's clear that state media is being used for and abused for electoral advantage, then we started doing monitoring traditional media. When it's clear that voters are being intimidated or bribery is being used to sort of influence how people vote, then you monitor the campaign period. And so we kind of view this as just kind of one other aspect that we need to be really looking at and exposing as a potential threat to the credibility of a broader process. So even if everything goes great on election day and everything's super organized and votes are cast in an orderly way and every vote is counted fairly, you still might be looking at an election that's compromised if the information environment around it is toxic. We know that disinformation has been used to intentionally confuse voters. We know it's been used to suppress voter turnout. That's very common, and we see in a lot of places, including the United States. We know that it can skew the kind of the playing field and make a process not competitive because it can create unfair advantages or disadvantages for certain contestants. We know that it can exacerbate exclusion, and particularly for marginalized people, and maybe overcrowd or crowd out divergent or different voices from the political discourse. It can also, through that, be playing on social divisions that can exacerbate triggers for electoral-related violence. But finally, one thing that we see in a lot of countries is disinformation being used just to sort of undermine people's confidence in democratic institutions. That can be, the election commission, that it's in charge of organizing an election, but it can also be civil society actors who are sort of charged with safeguarding the process because they're independent actors and independent voices. So we've been working a lot with our partners on that and really trying to figure out ways that we can kind of incorporate monitoring of disinformation as part of broader electoral analysis. And so that we're making sure that it's something that's being weighed when we're considering the credibility of an electoral process. As you know, through that, then we think that that can sort of help build scrutiny around the issue that can start to hold institutions accountable. And when I say institutions, that's not just political parties or candidates that might be benefiting from disinformation, you know, or governments that might have a role to play in mitigating disinformation, but also, you know, the tech companies and platforms that are also, you know, maybe accidentally or intentionally contributing to the issue as well.
Oh, thank you. You know, looking at this and working with political parties and political leaders, and hearing Jihad's story, a lot of it's reactionary. That you're investing a lot of time into the issue afterwards. When you're working with political leaders and different political parties and constituencies, you know, kind of forward-looking, how are you kind of adapting your advocacy to work in that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we've definitely learned is that this is an issue that needs to be integrated into, you know, into legal reforms, into electoral reforms, into, you know, if there are updates to the legal framework. This is an issue that always needs to be considered. I mean, you'd be amazed, like, you know, there are countries all around the world that have campaign finance laws, but they're not tracking political ads online at all. And so that's just like a total black hole. And so making sure that those kinds of things are built into, are kind of baked into election reform and updates to the legal framework initially. You know, so that's something that we were certainly kind of recommending as part of our observation statements. Certainly, again, we've kind of expanded who we consider stakeholders in the process, right? Because it used to always be kind of these traditional actors. It's the government, it's the legislature, it's political parties, it's civil society, it's the media. But now that pool is a bit bigger, and we're including the tech industry in that as well, and we have recommendations for them. Particularly when it comes to kind of increasing transparency on their platforms. You know, any kind of advocacy is obviously much stronger the more people, you know, if you have a broader coalition. So that's something that we work with our CSO partners in countries on making sure that they're working with other civic tech partners and maybe a more diverse group of CSOs to kind of push for these sorts of reforms. NDI is also kind of on a broader level. We're working with other democracy-related or human rights organizations like IRI and IFIS and International IDEA on a coalition to help work with tech companies to make sure that they are including democracy and human rights as a kind of focal point when they're thinking about product design and when they're thinking about policy, and kind of trying to advocate on those levels as well. That said, there are still a lot of challenges. Democratic elections have to be, they need to be accountable, and they need to be inclusive, and they need to be competitive, and they need to be transparent in order to be credible. And we've seen, especially when we're talking about the digital space, that it's inherently more opaque. You know, whether it's, you know, you're looking at fake accounts or fake media outlets or, you know, artificially boosted content that's coming from click farms or bots or troll armies, you know, all kinds of different computational propaganda that exists online and is just inherently less transparent. And we do know that there's still a lot of kind of safeguards that exist in the offline space that are, at the very least, very inconsistently applied when it comes to the digital space. Again, things like political finance transparency, advertisement transparency. You know, we have consumer protection laws in the offline space that are supposed to protect us from false advertising, but once you get into the digital space, that seems to fall apart. And so thinking about, you know, some of these at least kind of, I think the transparency piece is sort of the low-hanging fruit, because then, you know, you also start to tread into issues related to freedom of expression and freedom of speech that get much more complicated. But you know, those are kinds of the ways that we're trying to approach advocacy, again, from more of the kind of accountability and transparency standpoint.
When speaking of all those issues, one country comes to mind and, that's dealing with a lot of that and is also in the news is Ukraine. Geopolitically, it's straddled between Europe and Russia, and where Russia's influencing quite a bit, as well as, of course, that strategic aspect of being an ally and trading partner to Europe and the United States. Katya, you've worked Ukraine for a while and know the issue. Ukraine has had several elections, very unstable for that way, and disinformation is a part of all of that. What are you and IREX working on as far as kind of building resilience within communities in Ukraine, since this is such an issue that persists? How are you dealing with that?
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, first of all, for having me here. I'm really grateful to be a part of this panel and appreciate the work that my colleagues do to fight this issue. I think we should all be doing more. So yes, before I talk about Ukraine, just very quickly about IREX, I think we are new interaction members. So IREX is 50 years old. We work across the globe, and we have traditionally focused on education, youth, media sector support. So we have a lot of independent media strengthening communities and governance. And have observed not only in Ukraine, but in a lot of places, how the gains we have made in providing people access and high quality information by supporting the independent media sector have been sort of either not enough or even undermined by what is happening with the transformation of the information space. So in Ukraine in particular, this played out really dramatically in 2013, 2014. I was in Ukraine at the time. I was IREX's country director in Ukraine from 2014, 15 to 2018. And we have observed how by that time in Ukraine, we have been working with the independent media sector for about a decade and had also put a lot of effort in working with public institutions, libraries, to provide access to information. We operated on the premise that if people have high quality information and if they can access that information, they will make good decisions. Well, turns out that's not true in Ukraine, that's not true in the US, that's not true in Jordan, that's not true anywhere around the world anymore. So we had to come up with something different. We realized that that kind of transformation of space between the ecosystem and the where professional media produced information, people consumed, made decisions, that no longer stands. It has shifted dramatically, and what has changed, because propaganda was not new in Ukraine, it's not new in that part of the world, what's changed was the digital media, the social networks, and that had empowered such an unprecedented volume, reach, and speed of information that it kind of completely threw how we as humans operate. What Chris said about the paradox of choice really played into why we have observed people are vulnerable and why misinformation spreads so quickly in Ukraine and in other places. So I can talk a little bit about that. I did see the signal that we have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly. So we have developed an approach in Ukraine that focuses on people who consume information and who engage with information and kind of build that resilience on the level of individuals, communities, and right now we are lucky enough to work on a system level. We work with the education system, and we're building these skills into the education of the future generation. But before that, I really do want to make sure I have a little bit, give you a little bit of background of what we found, why this is so pervasive, and why misinformation spreads so quickly these days, what really has changed. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is that we now live in the time of information abundance. It really is unprecedented in human history. And there's a quote, who said that? There's a quote, it will come back to me who said that, but that we have Paleolithic brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And really, it is true. 90% of data that we have today has been produced in the last 2 years. Just think of that. There is more bytes of data that we have today, 40 times more bytes of data that we have today than stars in the observable universe. Every minute of the day, every minute of the day, 4.5 million YouTube videos are being watched. Every second of the day, 300 million photos are being uploaded on Instagram. There's ridiculous amounts of information. There's no way all of this information is good and we can navigate it successfully. So we have to make choices, and we don't make them rationally. We spend a lot of time interacting with information, a lot more than we used to. We are surrounded by this information ecosystem, not just in the US, not just in Ukraine, in places like Jordan, in places like Tunisia, where you can buy a put it together yourself smartphone for less than $14. Everyone's wired, everyone's online. It is a mistake to think that this digital transformation has not affected everywhere we work. But we spend more time interacting with information these days than we spend eating, drinking, talking to other people. We basically swim in this landscape. And that's because digital devices are addictive. How many of you have reached for your phone when you have heard someone else's message notification go off? The technology has been designed to trigger the same part of your brain that gets activated when people play slot machines in Vegas. It is the same pleasure and reward center that responds when we engage with digital devices. The third aspect in all of this is that misinformation is very easy to produce. It is much easier to produce a piece of misinformation, and that includes broadly malign intent or economic gain, than to produce a piece of quality reporting filled with facts, with balance of opinion, fact, and substantiated by all of the good information. So there's just a ton of junk out there. And we don't navigate it rationally. We apply a prism of, there's that choice paradox that kicks in, but there's also, we are emotionally and cognitively wired to make shortcuts when we are presented with unlimited amount of choice. We are wired to crave emotionally sensational information. It's that same mechanism that if you live in a medieval village and you see a troop of soldiers running at you, your instinct is to run to the highest tower, ring the bell, yell as loud as you can, warn everyone. Same applies when you see a piece of really sensational, troubling, scary, negative information online. Your instinct is to share. We don't really think about what it is. We just really want to share. And we also have all of these biases, emotions aside, there's cognition that kicks in. And some of the things you were talking about with the chilling effects, that's the repetition bias. The more you hear it, the more it gets engraved in part of your brain. You say something is true until it becomes true. And there's the familiarity bias. If it comes from someone you know, we're also programmed to believe it. There's the confirmation bias. If it agrees with what you already think is true, you're going to think it's true, even if it's not true. There is the endorsement effect. If it comes from an expert or a researcher, we also believe it's true. There's all of these things, stereotypes, selective recall, all of these things we have been designed to have to survive and to be mentally stable and healthy. They now work against us in this digital environment. And then there are the algorithms, which are neither good nor bad. They do not have a moral standing. They are designed to prioritize, to generate profit. So they will prioritize content that we like and share, and that is emotionally sensational and abusive, and also is filtered through this prism of cognitive biases. So they prioritize engagement. They do not prioritize democracy and governance, human rights, and we are caught in this. And while access is intuitive and easy these days, when I ask kids in Ukraine, how many of you did you have to ask your parents to show you how to use your smartphone when you got it? They laughed at me because we don't have to teach access anymore. It is so easy, but these skills to navigate what comes at you through these devices, they're not intuitive at all. They actually go against all of our intuitive processes. So we really have to teach that. And that's what our program in Ukraine does, is not just in Ukraine, we actually do this in 10 countries now, including Jordan, Tunisia, Indonesia, the 3 Baltic states, Serbia, I'm blanking on some, the US.
Well, I think it relates to the US because
Right.
especially if you talk, we all have that special aunt or uncle that circulates
Yeah.
that one Facebook post that you've probably seen 2 or 3 times. And again, it's that suspicious mind aspect of where some people are taught to question that while others just hit send and reply and forward that along.